I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld. We're Ireland's top podcast for 2025, and now we've got a new website. So if you want to learn more about crime and criminals, if you want stories, extras, and podcast subscriber specials, go to www.crimeworld.com.
So when I came in this morning, we had an email in, or a message in, basically defending John Paul O'Connell. Now, John Paul O'Connell is the father of Mason Conway. Now, anybody who's turned on the news or opened a newspaper or a website will have seen the absolutely horrific case of Mason O'Connell's stepmother being convicted this week, given a life sentence for his murder. Tegan McGhee. A truly shocking case. It comes on the back of a number of other kind of shocking cases where certainly the role of the state in looking after kids, vulnerable kids, has been highlighted, in particular the murder-suicide recently in Clondalkin and some of the other cases involving Daniel Arabose and other kids as well. Tegan McGee was the stepmother of Mason O'Connell, or certainly John Paul O'Connell's partner. Why was she convicted this week, and tell us the circumstances of the case?
So basically, this all happened in 2021. The emergency services were called to so Tegan McGee was living with her partner at the time, John Paul O'Connell, and his son Mason was in their care. He'd been in their care for 6 months at this time, and essentially, when they got there, Mason was on the ground unconscious, and he had really serious injuries to his body, and they were told that he had fallen from a bunk bed and hit his head. So obviously he was brought to hospital. He was on life support for 3 days. It actually was said in court how when they pulled back the curtain, medics in the operating theatre gasped at the sight of his injuries. So she originally told Gardaí that he was a bold child, made all these claims that were untrue, and then so this was in 2021, she was due to stand trial last year, and she admitted his manslaughter and his assault, but said it wasn't murder. But then 3 days into the trial in November, she pleaded guilty to murder. She was up for sentencing this week, but the public wouldn't have known any of these people's identity because her defence were successful in having a reporting restriction in place. And that was lifted this week after Media House, who operate Crime World, and RTE applied to have it lifted.
So that's the basics of the case. But it's, I suppose, the lead up to the death of Mason that has to be looked at. Certainly the injuries he sustained were particularly brutal, and I think it was described in court as being something akin to what you would see with a car crash victim.
Yeah.
He had suffered certainly his liver had been damaged. Yeah. Catastrophic brain injuries, really, really serious physical injuries. Yeah,
he had injuries, bruises all down his arms, back and legs, and he had a fractured rib or broken rib, and it was actually starting to heal. So they obviously could tell then that there had been historic abuse there as well. It wasn't just from that particular incident.
Yeah, so John Paul O'Connell is the child's father. Now, he's not suspected of being there, certainly the night that Mason suffered the fatal injuries.
No.
But there is a context in which he has come before the courts as well, because of course he wasn't named either this week. And obviously Tegan McGee was convicted of murder, and her picture dominated. But John Paul O'Connell was also named. Now, he wasn't convicted in relation to the fatal injuries, but he was convicted of a number of charges that probably all relate to the circumstances in the lead up to Mason's death and in the aftermath.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, in 2024, he got 7 years in jail. So yeah, as you said, the identity wouldn't have been out there at the time. But he was convicted of 4 charges. It was child cruelty, endangerment, impeding the apprehension of the person who we knew or believed to have murdered Mason. Obviously, that was, now we know, Tegan McGee. So basically, what seemed to have happened on the day that Mason was killed was that she sent a flurry of texts. He came home from work, and she had been really trying to get in contact with him. Then he called emergency services. So basically, it was a lie about him falling from the bunk bed, and he impeded the prosecution by telling these lies, and obviously then there had been abuse, and he obviously would have been living in that house, Gardaí, and the court held that he would have been aware of what was going on, and he did nothing to stop it. He did nothing to protect his child, basically.
Yeah, so the circumstances were that initially John Paul and Tegan McGee were both at Mason's funeral. The guards, it seems from the court case, had very definite suspicions straight away, but obviously these things are hard to prove, and it takes a period of time. So in the aftermath of Mason's death, obviously his mother, Elizabeth Conway, wouldn't have been privy to the Garda suspicions or the hospital suspicions necessarily. And in that aftermath then, Tegan McGee and John Paul seem to have put on a face, really. John Paul spoke at his son's funeral. Now, the email I got in said he didn't know anything at that stage. But obviously he pled guilty to a number of charges. And one of those charges, as you said, were to do with, I suppose, connected to the build-up of it. Yeah,
well, child cruelty is, and endangerment, and obviously the impeding the prosecution, that can happen after the fact. But it is a fact, and has been said in court, that Mason had historic injuries on his body.
Exactly.
And he was his parent. So he is implicated there.
Exactly. And of course, Tegan McGee had offered a manslaughter plea. So I suppose, would the circumstances like that where somebody loses the plot with a child and maybe on that day does something and possible a manslaughter verdict could be reached in something like that. But what clearly, in my opinion, would have gone against her was this historic abuse.
Yeah.
So you could see in the build-up to the murder.
Yeah.
As you said, it was described how he'd suffered these injuries. He'd healed from some of them. And when he was... when the medical staff looked at it, you could see that this wasn't a sort of one-off moment of madness. If it could ever be, obviously would never justify anything, but it clearly wasn't. That wasn't the case.
No, and I suppose John Paul O'Connell as well, yes, he was not suspected of the actual murder, but I suppose there has been laid out bare in court how Mason was treated in the weeks up to his death. And there's evidence heard, like really, really hard to read evidence of a 4-year-old about how he basically had no bedding on his mat. Like there was just a mattress that he was forced to sleep on, that he was not allowed out of his, I think it was nearly 4 days he wasn't allowed out of his room because, as the guards were told by Tegan, which is just an untrue allegations, he was a bold and cheeky child and that he deserved this punishment, which no child deserves, but he was left sitting on the floor. I think there was one incident where a friend called to the house with a chocolate egg and they wouldn't let him see him. The mothers, so obviously Mason's mother, her family, where there was video calls that were cancelled, scheduled kind of calls that were cancelled because they were told that Mike Mason was behaving badly. So all of this in the run up and how he was treated and that neglect of a child where he's left sitting in his bedroom floor, not allowed out at 4 years old. So I suppose that paints a picture of, the kind of
it's a criminal picture
of neglect of a child, and and he was living with his father, so that's where that is brought into.
And the judge summed up the case back when John Paul was convicted. He described the fact that he had allowed his defenceless son to be subjected to a frightening campaign of physical abuse by his partner, and by misrepresenting the boy's catastrophic fatal injuries as having been caused by a fall from a bunk bed, which he described as a shameful betrayal of the child. And he said, Justice Paul McDermott said, the defendant bore a very high level of criminal responsibility for failing to nurture and protect his son. And he highlighted the callousness in how the child was treated by his father and the defendant's absolute disregard for his son's welfare, and said it was extremely difficult to understand. And it is. Now, you described Tegan McGee as saying the child was bold or not basically doing what he was told, you described her saying that.
She said that, yeah.
Yeah. Now, it is, inconceivable that anybody would think that a 4-year-old, 4-year-olds just don't sit quietly and do what they're told. It's just absolutely, it's sort of insane for somebody to even believe that they could impose that on a child.
No.
Now, Tegan McGee, even I suppose we heard then from her sister in court. Tegan McGee, it seems from what her sister said in a social media post, and the sister attended the court and had words with her, but she basically said that they were fooled for a year afterwards, that Tegan McGee had clearly denied everything, insisted the child had had a fall, it was all stitch up or whatever, she was a victim, which does seem to be going around even in this defence of John Paul, even though he did admit to his offences as well and make apologies in court. What did the sister say about Tegan McGee? Because, she describes killing the child by shaking him and then hitting him. Yeah. I mean, it's bewildering, really.
It is bewildering. I suppose they said that they basically weren't aware of
this is Tegan McGee's family.
This is Tegan McGee's family. So Shannon McGee, she basically said, so to put in context, Shannon McGee actually, she went to the sentencing hearing. Her and Tegan McGee's foster parents were in court, but they were there to support Mason's mother, and they were clearly seen. We have our colleagues were there, and they were, putting their arms out for Mason's mother. So they were there in that context. At that point, they had kind of seen what Tegan McGee was. But when she was leaving, Shannon McGee, it's been reported, shouted out "rod in hell," and then she followed this up with a post yesterday where she basically said, she described her sister as an evil monster. She said, I wasn't going to say anything about this, but I refuse to live in someone else's shame. Because obviously we know, the families of offenders can sometimes be dragged into it by saying, how did you not know and stuff. So they're making it very clear that they believed her story, that she was struggling and all this kind of thing. So obviously now they know the truth, and they said no amount of words can describe how cold and cruel she is. She fooled us all for a full year before she was arrested and the truth came out. I couldn't understand how the person I knew and loved my whole life was someone I didn't even know. I never said anything about this before because they weren't allowed to be named. Not me or any member of my family knew of the horrific things that happened to Mason. He was kept from his family as well as us. We believed he had fallen from a bunk bed, as did everyone else. And then they go on to say how, they also lost Mason, and there was relatives on Mason's mother's side who spoke on their behalf and also said the same thing, that he was betrayed in this way. But in their experience, he was a lovely child, full of life, full of energy, and, was so caring that, if anyone was upset, he would hang on to them, cuddling them and stuff like that. So then she basically ended it with talking about how beautiful he was, and said Tegan and John Paul not only took Mason's life but ruined anyone else's along with it.
So I mean, it's an incredibly sort of heartrending tale when you actually hear it, and a child of that age should. It should be just the most normal of human instincts to seek to protect the child. Yeah. Even beyond the fatal injuries that he suffered, it seems to be an attempt to break the spirit of the child in the build-up, which the judge actually also spoke about in the case, John Paul's case. He said he was left on the basis of the evidence found in his bedroom without the basic comforts of sheets and a duvet. This should have been a place of safety and comfort. Much occurred not only in his own home, but worse, in his bedroom, which turned into a place of fear. So it becomes a kind of obviously, this sort of cases, it shouldn't be allowed to happen.
No, it's really hard to read, actually, and it's just, you just think of this child. He's so 4 years old. They have lots of innocence and lots of energy, but they're also they can't in any way mind themselves, really. So you can just imagine him sitting on a floor, so confused. The people that he thought he obviously, because as well, the attachment at that age, he obviously probably did love Tegan McGee and his father, and didn't understand why this was happening to him. So it's really hard to think about.
Any abuse that occurs to a child at that age, it's normal for the child. It's shocking to say, so he probably, this is a normal thing for him because that's what's happening. Now it's not normal, clearly, but a child can't, look at it objectively. So again, in the aftermath of the case, which I think it's brought home by the fact that people can be named, and it is important because it makes people, I suppose, think about the case in a different way. Yeah. But in the aftermath, Mason's mother's family have come out and certainly his grandmother the family has spoken about how the grandmother contacted Tusla.
Yeah.
Now, it's easy to kick Tusla with all of these cases, but certainly, according to that testimony, they were aware that there was issues.
Yeah, they're saying they're aware. So basically, as we said, John Paul O'Connell and Tegan McGee had care of Mason for 6 months before this happened, and there was weeks where basically nobody's seen him, nobody was allowed to see him. There was, as I said, calls cancelled and all that. So, so Mason's grandmother, so his mother's mother, contacted Tusla and basically said that she was extremely concerned about what was going to happen. He said, that she had a motherly instinct that something was wrong, and she was right in the end. And they basically want kind of awareness to be raised. They're obviously aware that it can't help Mason, but just in terms of, I suppose, vetting protocol, and also, can you follow a family member's concerns? Now, they're not sure if anything did happen in the background, but they weren't told about it. So I suppose it's all of this communication as well. And of course, we all aware of, we know, you hear of Tusla getting kicked, as you said, but also you hear of, how there's absolutely seems to be massive issues with staffing and all that kind of thing. And you can understand that, but it's just these cases just keeps seeming to come into the public forum, and it's just a child that suffers, and it's hard to know where to go from there. But I guess, and I was actually asking you this question, and it is answered by Tusla. They do, when a child dies, conduct reviews into that case. But, the usual sort of statement was that they can't speak about it for, they can't speak about individual cases. But a spokesperson for Tusla did tell us this week that the agency was experiencing unprecedented demand for its services. But, if you were Mason O'Connell's family, you can understand how and we've talked about it as well. How does this situation occur where, is there meetings happening? If he has historic injuries on his body, is there any way of monitoring this?
Yeah. And look, we don't have the easy or quick answers to that. Yeah. But I think everybody accepts that these things shouldn't be allowed to happen. And of course, it comes in the back of a case involving Wayne O'Reilly, who killed his son, Oisin Redden, just last week. And again, a very, very shocking case of murder-suicide in West Dublin, where Oisin was asphyxiated and died in his bed.
Yeah.
Now, certainly there was interactions with Tusla. There was a lot of chaos, certainly in the build-up to that, including Oisin and his father Wayne going missing at one point and being found, according to reports, in a hotel in Limerick. So there was certainly a lot going on there. But again, these issues, maybe there aren't simple answers, but there should be answers at some point. And again, they come on the back of those other cases.
Yeah, exactly.
Kyron Diernan and Daniel Arabose, where two kids kind of fell off the edge of the system.
Yeah. Yeah, and the spokesperson for the family, he does make the point, about how if the grandmother's calls had been listened to, maybe Mason, this wouldn't have happened. Now, we don't know that they weren't followed up without the knowledge of the family, but, it is a fair point. And I suppose another point that he made as well is about, the vetting of people who are, because obviously Mason had his father, but then anyone else who's going to be a caregiver, the partner of a father, we don't know. There is obviously vetting procedures in place, but they wanted to make a call for, really in-depth vetting procedures, because you actually raised the question earlier, we don't know much about Tegan McGee.
No, and look, we don't. Look, if there was some sort of particularly relevant convictions, we would have heard of them this week. So in all likelihood, and that's not to say Tusla can catch everything, because of course they can't, right?
No, of course.
So she Tegan McGee, she'll serve life now, and I think she's been taken to Limerick prison. But it may be the case that she was vetted and that she didn't have anything that particularly stood out. She's not going to have, possibly, maybe she doesn't have previous convictions or anything like that. But, when you hear her description of causing the death of the child, it just bewilders me that people like that even exist. And of course, when you hear about people killing children, which we certainly, there's been a number of really high profile cases in the UK, and some of them involving women, not just men. It all seems to be these people who take these children into their care and then become extremely frustrated when they behave like children.
Yeah.
Which is, 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 2-year-olds cry. They don't do what they're told. They don't, they're not adults.
No, of course, yeah.
And I mean, just the callousness even of her justification, and her as well, of course, she while she might have pled guilty once the case started, she effectively put the family, it was literally at the very last moment.
Yeah, and she only pled guilty because the evidence was so compelling against her. It was a couple of days into the trial, so I think it was very clear that there was no hope for her. So it's not that she was trying to, as you said, save the family any kind of peace or anything like that. I mean, and
this is what she told investigators, and it honestly bewilders me. Like, she said that Mason was a wild child who was cheeky and wouldn't do what he was told. She described putting him on the bold step and grounding him in his room, where he had to sit on the floor and was only allowed out for emergencies or go to his bathroom. And he was kept in his room for 4 days in a row before he was fatally injured. And she said she has snapped and recalled shaking him and screaming at him to behave. Just terrible, the thought of, this is an adult in charge of a 4-year-old, and you're literally asking a 4-year-old not to behave as a 4-year-old, and it's cost him his life.
And this is probably what the family mean by, by vetting, because obviously, as you said, of course, their criminal past would be looked into, but in terms of, people's capability of actually taking care of a child, as the judge said, she clearly wasn't able to cope. And instead of asking for help, she chose cruelty. So I suppose you also have to, is there kind of supports there for people who are just thrust into this situation where they're all of a sudden living with a young child and may have not experienced this before? So is it just, okay, they're going to take care of the child and off they go, So all these kind of questions, maybe there is procedures that we know nothing about, but the family, Mason's family, have raised these questions. So hopefully they're looked into.
Yeah, so look, it's a very... what can you say? I mean, this has been, it's been a hard start to the year with some really, really tragic cases. And of course, there was further developments this week when there was a man arrested in Portlaoise prison in connection with the death of another 4-year-old, Tyg Farrell.
Yeah.
So, these situations are it should never be normalised. But
no.
Very, very tragic.
No, and then obviously you have Daniel Arbose and Kyron Durnan. Kyron Durnan hasn't been found. Daniel Arbose lay in a dumping ground for years before he was found. So, and again, these are obviously different cases, but again, Tusla has been involved in those cases, and it's just always the child, isn't it, that suffers. And it's I know it's maybe it's easy for us to kind of talk here and sit here and give out about it, but it's just it's hard to know.
It is. There's no easy answers, but it should be given out about nonetheless.
Of course, yeah. And I suppose maybe we should finish with some of the words from Mason's mother, Elizabeth Conway, because obviously she gave a harrowing victim impact statement outside the court. As she said herself, like, this happened in 2021, so she's been waiting 5 years for justice. So, and she also told how, Mason's, we've gone through the injuries already, but like his head, she said, was 10 times the size of it normally when he was in hospital, and she had to make the decision to turn up his life support after 3 days. So she described Tegan McGee as pure evil. She said Mason brought so much love and happiness to us all. She obviously completely trusted Mason's father and his partner. She said she waited for what felt like days to come out of theatre, and then saw him. This is Mason, saw him, her beautiful little child hooked up to all the wires. She said, I had to make the hardest decision a mother could make to turn off his life support. And she said, my son's life was taken by someone so evil, someone he had loved and trusted. And she said, basically that her life ended. She said, I can't imagine the pain he suffered in the weeks leading up to his death. And she kind of said, she'll never be the same again. My perfect little boy, I'll never see his face again. The words that come to mind is betrayal. I trusted them to look after my beautiful, innocent baby boy.
Yeah. Okay, Eimear. Well, look, we'll come back to this case if there's further developments on it. But, our sympathies are with Mason O'Connell's family.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Niall.